Justice is supposed to be blind, but in the city of Brookside, it had long been corrupted by prejudice, power, and greed. When a young black woman named Alana Carter is framed for a crime she didn't commit, the entire legal system seems determined to destroy her life. Behind the scenes, racist cops bribe a judge to ensure Alana's downfall, until an unthinkable twist changes everything. In a stunning turn of events, the very woman they sought to bury suddenly holds their future in her hands. In this story of power struggles, betrayal, and impossible comebacks, the tables turn in the most dramatic way possible. Brookside was a city with a complicated history. Decades ago, it had been a thriving industrial hub filled with bustling factories and an optimistic workforce. Over time, however, factories closed, jobs dried up, and the city's fortunes faded. The once proud neighborhoods fell prey to crime, political scheming, and unchecked corruption. Newspapers like the Brookside Tribune did their best to expose misconduct, but the powers that be often twisted the truth, using old money ties and political influence to keep their shady dealings under wraps. Among the institutions tainted by this corruption was the Brookside Police Department. Behind the well-crafted image of officers who served and protected, there lurked a small faction of crooked cops led by Detective John Kessler and Sergeant Rick Marlowe. This group was infamous for planting evidence on black and brown residents, turning minor offenses into life-ruining felonies, and exploiting every ounce of their power to line their pockets. Most disturbingly, it wasn't only about money. Prejudice ran deep in their ranks, fueling their willingness to harass and brutalize the most vulnerable in Brookside. Alana Carter was exactly the kind of person Kessler and Marlowe preyed upon. A resourceful, ambitious, and compassionate woman in her early 30s, Alana had grown up in Brookside. She was no stranger to its underbelly. Raised by her grandmother after her parents passed away in a tragic car accident, she learned early on how to hold her head high amidst adversity. She had big dreams: to study criminal justice, to rise through the ranks of the law, and ultimately to protect the very people the system often abandoned. Quietly but steadily, Alana had done just that. A star student with a fiery passion for justice, she graduated at the top of her class from Brookside Community College, then went on to earn a full scholarship to a prestigious law school in New York. She returned to her hometown armed with knowledge, confidence, and a determination to right the wrongs she saw daily. But Brookside was resistant to change. Even with her qualifications, opportunities within the local justice system were scarce for a black woman, especially one known for speaking out against police harassment. Detective Kessler had encountered Alana several times before. Whenever she witnessed or suspected foul play by officers, she was the first to raise questions, file complaints, or even organize community meetings. Kessler hated that. He considered her a nuisance, a troublemaker who threatened the good old way of doing business. And it wasn't just Alana's activism that enraged him. It was her unapologetic refusal to back down in a town that often forced marginalized people into silence. Over time, Kessler found ways to intimidate her. He'd pull her over for minor traffic infractions, glare at her in court corridors, and even spread rumors that she was involved with local gang members. Alana, however, stayed strong. She was on a path that promised change, and that change threatened to upend the shady empire Kessler and Marlowe had built in Brookside. Eventually, her resistance made her the perfect target for one of the most sinister schemes the department had ever concocted. Detective John Kessler and Sergeant Rick Marlowe were restless. The Brookside Police Department might have had its fair share of corruption, but even among the questionable crowd, these two stood out for their brazen disregard for justice. They met one evening in the smoky back room of an old bar called Harper's Tavern. It was a low-key spot frequented by off-duty cops looking for a stiff drink and a chance to vent about city politics. Over the years, Kessler and Marlowe had made that back room their private war council, where they plotted everything from small-time shakedowns to more elaborate crimes. That night, Kessler leaned forward, swirling a half-empty glass of whiskey. "She's got to go," he muttered, eyes glinting with barely contained malice. He didn't have to say who she was. Both men knew he meant Alana Carter. Marlowe nodded, jaw tight, as though simply thinking her name annoyed him. Kessler continued, "She's getting traction in the community. People trust her. If she keeps going, She'll push for an investigation into police conduct. You know what that means. What it meant, the one said, was that the skeletons in their closet would come crashing out. Years of false arrests, planted drugs, stolen evidence, and unreported bribes. If Alana found a legitimate foothold in the legal system, maybe as a city prosecutor or even an assistant district attorney, she could dismantle their entire operation. She had the knowledge, the drive, and the moral compass to do it. "We need something big," Marlowe hissed, tapping his empty glass against the tabletop. "She's never had so much as a parking ticket. We plant a bag of weed, and it's not going to make a dent. She'll be back in a week, her reputation intact." Kessler rubbed his temples, thinking. He'd orchestrated false charges before, but never against someone as well-connected as Alana. People respected her. Even judges, in public at least, acknowledged her dedication to the law. "We gotta paint her as a real criminal," he said finally. "Money laundering, drug trafficking, bribery, something that makes the city recoil in horror." They hashed out the plan for hours. By the end of the night, their whiskey glasses were empty, their cigarettes extinguished in overflowing ashtrays, and their hearts burning with hateful resolve. The scheme was straightforward but required a conspiratorial judge to make it airtight. Kessler knew exactly where to look. Judge Stephen Langley, a longtime ally of the corrupt cops, owed Kessler and Marlowe more than a few favors. Rumor had it Judge Langley had a gambling addiction. He was deep in debt, and Kessler had once turned a blind eye when Langley caused a DUI accident that was hushed up. So, the plan was set. Kessler and Marlowe would fabricate evidence of large-scale drug possession or distribution, pinned squarely on Alana. They would bribe or blackmail Judge Langley into issuing a warrant, ensuring bail was denied. By the time Alana fought her way out legally, her name and her future in Brookside would be destroyed. They ended the night with a secret handshake and a pair of bitter smiles. In their minds, by framing Alana Carter for a serious felony, they would kill two birds with one stone. Silence the most vocal critic of their corrupt empire and send a message to the community that no one stands in the way of Brookside's dirty cops. A week after their meeting at Harper's Tavern, Kessler and Marlowe set their plan into motion. Their first step was to create a paper trail that would implicate Alana in illegal drug activities. Marlowe had a contact in a shady underworld circle, small-time criminals who owed him favors to avoid harassment or arrest. These individuals were well-versed in forging documents, and in a matter of days, they produced false ledgers, shipping receipts, and text message transcripts connecting Alana to a fictional cartel based in another state. Late one night, under the cover of darkness, Kessler and Marlowe broke into Alana's modest apartment. They wore gloves and black hoodies, stealthy as prowling panthers. Kessler forced open a small window, while Marlowe kept watch on the deserted street below. Inside, Kessler planted bags filled with a suspicious white substance, baking soda, carefully packaged to look like cocaine, tucked away in the storage closet and under the kitchen sink. He also hid a burner phone that contained incriminating text messages, carefully dated to suggest that Alana had been orchestrating drug deals for months. The next day, Kessler submitted an anonymous tip to his own precinct's drug enforcement unit, claiming that Alana Carter was a major distributor. He made sure this tip rose through the right channels, coming to rest on the desk of an officer he trusted to keep quiet. Within hours, a police raid was scheduled. The raid itself was a spectacle. Heavily armed officers, SWAT gear, blaring sirens meant to intimidate not just Alana but the entire community. They wanted Brookside to remember the day Alana Carter was taken down. When the raid occurred, Alana was caught completely off guard. She was in the middle of drafting a community advocacy proposal in her living room when SWAT officers burst through the door, yelling for her to get on the ground. Confused, terrified, and outraged, Alana complied. The next thing she knew, she was being handcuffed and hauled outside while neighbors watched in horror. Some of them shouted in protest, insisting Alana was innocent, but the police bulldozed through, claiming they had a warrant and credible evidence. At the station, Kessler personally oversaw her booking. In a twisted display of mockery, he read out the charges: drug trafficking, possession with intent to distribute, conspiracy. The severity of these allegations was staggering, enough to ruin any person's life, let alone someone with aspirations of serving in the justice system. Alana felt dizzy, nauseous. She tried to protest, but Kessler and Marlowe smirked, ignoring her pleas. That same day, Judge Stephen Langley, after receiving a hefty bribe and a discreet threat from Kessler, signed off on denying Alana bail. The official justification was that she posed a flight risk due to supposed ties with out-of-state criminals. It was a sham, but it worked. Alana Carter was taken away, locked in a holding cell with none of her friends or family allowed to see her. Brookside was stunned. How could this woman, a local role model, an activist, be involved in a high-level drug operation? The news spread like wildfire, the headlines in the Brookside Tribune condemning her. Underneath all of it was a carefully orchestrated web of lies, quietly engineered by Kessler, Marlowe, and Judge Langley. Alana was now at the center of an inferno, and she had no idea how she'd survive. In the claustrophobic confines of her holding cell, Alana Carter felt a whirlwind of emotions: shock, fear, anger, and an unwavering sense of injustice. She knew she was innocent. Anyone who truly knew her was certain these charges were absurd. Yet, the array of fabricated evidence, the burner phone, the alleged drug stash, the bogus financial documents, pointed in one incriminating direction: her. For 3 days, she was largely isolated, allowed only a handful of short phone calls. Her grandmother, Evelyn Carter, pleaded with the police to let her see Alana, but the request was repeatedly denied. In the eyes of the corrupt system, Alana was suddenly a kingpin, a narrative that served to keep her locked up and cut off from support. On the rare occasions she was allowed out of her cell, she endured cold stares from guards and whispered taunts that she was a disgrace. Some officers looked at her with pity, convinced she'd been framed, but they were too afraid to speak up against Kessler and Marlowe. Despite the suffocating despair, Alana's mind refused to surrender. She had studied criminal law. She knew how evidence could be manipulated. Instead of letting fear paralyze her, she began formulating ideas for her defense. She mentally noted all the possible ways she could prove her innocence: timestamps that didn't add up, witnesses who could place her elsewhere, community members who could vouch for her character, and any possible leads that might shed light on the real perpetrators behind this scheme. But time was not on her side. The more days she spent in detention, the more Brookside turned against her. Online forums lit up with discussions, some outraged by her arrest, others swearing she was guilty. The local TV station regurgitated the police's story without question, fueling the rumor mill. The turning point came on the morning of her arraignment. Alana was finally escorted into a small, windowless meeting room where her court-appointed attorney, Jason Meyer, sat with a folder of legal documents. Jason was a young, earnest public defender, overwhelmed by a caseload too large for one person to manage. Nonetheless, he believed in Alana's innocence from the moment he met her. "They have an overwhelming amount of evidence, Miss Carter," Jason said, flipping through the pages. His tone was grave, but something about it seems too neat. "It's too perfectly laid out." Alana nodded. "That's because it's staged," she replied. "We have to prove it's fabricated. We have to find out who's behind this." Jason looked at her with sympathy. "We will try, but Judge Langley has set a high bar. You've been denied bail. They're treating this as a major trafficking case. If we want to fight this, we'll need a lot of proof, and we'll need it quickly." In that moment, despite the suffocating bleakness, Alana felt a spark of hope. She was not alone. She had an ally, even if he was underfunded and overworked. And she had her own intelligence, her own resilience. She might have been trapped in a system designed to break her, but she was determined to fight back. She was determined to show Brookside, and the entire world, just how far the corrupt would go to destroy an innocent life. While Alana braced herself for a legal battle, across town, Judge Stephen Langley paced anxiously in his lavish home office. It was a room filled with dark mahogany furniture, thick Persian rugs, and a bookshelf packed with prestigious legal tomes. But none of that exuded comfort tonight. Langley's nerves were frayed, and his palms were clammy with cold sweat. He had just finished a phone call with Detective Kessler. The detective's voice had been smug. Kessler assured him that if Langley continued to play along, handing down harsh rulings, ignoring any inconsistencies in the prosecution's evidence, he would receive a generous kickback once the dust settled. Kessler had even hinted at a future promotion that Langley would benefit from if certain city positions opened up. But Langley was deeply in debt, thanks to his crippling gambling addiction. His usual haunt was a hidden backroom casino on the outskirts of Brookside, where he frequently lost thousands in a single night. The casino's loan sharks were circling, demanding payment, so when Kessler and Marlowe had approached him with an offer, a hefty sum in exchange for ensuring Alana Carter remained locked up and eventually found guilty, Langley hadn't hesitated. Fear and greed were powerful motivators. Yet guilt gnawed at him. He was no stranger to questionable rulings, having taken bribes in smaller cases, but this was different. The entire community knew Alana Carter. The moral weight of framing an innocent woman for serious felonies pressed down on him more than he cared to admit. Every time he glanced at the framed photos on his desk, his smiling wife and his 2 young daughters, he felt a knot in his stomach. How could he face them, knowing what he was doing to someone else's child? Desperate for a momentary escape, Langley poured himself a generous glass of bourbon, sipping it as he gazed out of the tall windows into his darkened yard. The city lights of Brookside glittered in the distance, a stark reminder of how many souls lived under the mercy of a justice system that he was perverting. He tried to justify his actions. If I don't do this, the loan sharks will ruin me. Kessler will leak everything. I'll lose my career, my family, my reputation. That rationalization offered him little comfort. He was in a bind, one he'd spent years weaving through crooked deals and reckless bets. Now, it was all culminating in this single, high-profile injustice against Alana Carter. With a shaky hand, he finished his drink and set the glass down on his mahogany desk. Tomorrow, he would walk into the Brookside County Courthouse, presiding over Alana's initial hearing. Tomorrow, he would publicly brand an innocent woman a criminal, and he loathed himself for it. A silent vow formed in his mind. Just one last job. After this, I'm out. He deluded himself into thinking that once he cleared his debts, he could reform and leave the dirty dealings behind. But as he'd learned soon enough, the price for redemption would be far higher than he could ever pay. While Alana sat in jail, the community she'd worked so hard to uplift did not remain silent. Over the years, Alana had built strong connections: neighborhood leaders, religious figures, local business owners, and civil rights activists who admired her commitment to justice. Word of her arrest spread like wildfire, igniting outrage among those who knew her character firsthand. Every evening, small groups gathered outside the police station, holding candles and signs that declared "Free Alana Carter" and "Stop Corruption Now." The protests started out modest, just a dozen or so dedicated supporters, but their numbers swelled day by day. Soon, hundreds of voices rose up against the injustice. One of the most vocal supporters was Pastor Benjamin Wright from the historic St. Elijah Baptist Church. During Sunday sermons, he openly criticized the police department's history of racism and demanded an independent investigation into Alana's case. Local journalists also began sniffing around. Although the big headlines still parroted the police narrative, a few reporters at the Brookside Tribune grew suspicious. Alana Carter had once collaborated with them on a piece exposing poor living conditions in low-income housing. She had a reputation for integrity. Now she was labeled a drug trafficker? It didn't add up. Journalists started digging, requesting documents, speaking to neighbors who witnessed the raid. Inside the police station, there were whispered conversations among a handful of honest officers who believed Alana was being framed. But fear hung heavy in the air. No one wanted to become Kessler and Marlowe's next target. Only one young officer, Isabel Reyes, dared to discreetly approach the protesters outside one night. She was new to the force and hadn't yet been hardened by the toxic culture. When one of Alana's friends recognized her, Isabel quietly said, "I can't comment on the record, but don't stop what you're doing. Protesting, demanding answers, it matters." And inside her cell, Alana heard the chants outside. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to hope. The faint sound of chanting filtered through the small window near the corridor of Alana's cell. Though muffled by thick concrete walls, the voices of the protesters carried a strength that rekindled something inside her: hope. She wasn't alone. The city she had fought for was now fighting for her. Her lawyer, Jason Meyer, arrived that evening with promising news. "We filed a motion to dismiss based on inconsistencies in the police report," he explained, flipping through his notes. "Judge Langley will likely reject it, but that's not the point. We're laying the groundwork for an appeal." Alana nodded. "Have you heard anything from outside?" Jason hesitated before offering a small smile. "People are rallying for you. The protests are growing, and there's talk. Some local attorneys and civil rights groups are starting to take an interest in your case." A flicker of relief crossed Alana's face. If they could draw the attention of a high-powered legal team, her chances of clearing her name would improve drastically. Across town, however, Kessler and Marlowe were tightening their grip. They knew they had stirred a hornet's nest and were determined to crush any resistance before it could gain traction. They ramped up their intimidation tactics, threatening witnesses who dared to speak on Alana's behalf and manipulating evidence to withstand scrutiny from the defense. Judge Langley, meanwhile, complied with their every request. In pretrial hearings, he allowed questionable evidence while dismissing any mention of police misconduct as speculative. It seemed like a clean sweep for the corrupt trio, but cracks had begun to appear in their carefully orchestrated plan. One evening, Sergeant Rick Marlowe returned home to find a plain envelope slipped under his front door. Inside was a single photograph of him and Kessler meeting with Judge Langley in a dimly lit parking lot. On the back of the photo were typed words, "We know." There was no signature, no return address. Marlowe's heart pounded so fiercely he thought he might pass out. Who took this picture? How did they get it? He immediately called Kessler, who rushed over, his face twisted in rage. "We've got a problem," Marlowe muttered, shoving the photograph at him. Kessler's jaw clenched. He flipped it over, reading the ominous message, then exhaled sharply. "We need to figure out who's behind this." Fearful that it might be an honest cop or even a federal agent, they compiled a list of potential whistleblowers. Had someone inside the precinct turned against them? 2 days later, Judge Langley received an anonymous email on his personal account. It contained the same photograph, along with a cryptic message. "TikTok, Judge. Truth is coming." Langley nearly dropped his phone. Anxiety flared in his chest like a burning ember. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he gulped down a glass of water. In a panic, he tried calling Kessler, but the detective was tied up. For the first time, Langley felt truly alone. Meanwhile, Officer Isabel Reyes had been carefully watching the mounting tensions at the station. She noticed Kessler's uncharacteristic scowl, Marlowe's abrupt outbursts, and the hush-hush murmurs that followed them wherever they went. Feeling emboldened, Isabel decided to dig deeper. Late at night, she combed through internal files, searching for any record that might indicate tampering in Alana's case. What she found was damning. Mismatched evidence logs, conflicting statements from officers, timestamps that made no sense. She printed out a few key documents and hid them in her locker, her heart pounding with both excitement and dread. Back in her cell, Alana prayed for just one piece of exonerating evidence. She knew that if even the slightest discrepancy came to light, it could open the floodgates to prove her innocence. The cracks in the conspiracy were growing. Even though Alana couldn't see them yet, the photograph, Isabel's discovery, these were small but critical signs that Kessler, Marlowe, and Langley were losing control, and karma was creeping closer. As Alana's trial date approached, the tension in Brookside escalated. On one side stood Kessler, Marlowe, and Judge Langley, still pushing their narrative of her guilt. On the other side, Alana's supporters grew louder, more organized. The protests outside the courthouse swelled. Signs demanding justice for Alana Carter multiplied. Local musicians performed songs of resistance during rallies. Then, an unexpected ally stepped into the fray. Elaine Patterson, a high-profile civil rights attorney from the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, had been following the case from afar. Copies of police files had been forwarded to her office, highlighting suspicious details. Intrigued, Patterson traveled to Brookside to meet with Alana and Jason. In the cramped visitors' room of the jail, Patterson's presence was a breath of fresh air. She was a seasoned professional, sharp-eyed, calm-voiced, her gray hair pinned back in a neat bun. She listened intently as Alana recounted her story, her activism, the antagonism from Kessler, the suspicious raid. Patterson's expression grew increasingly grim. "We need to dig deeper," she concluded. "This isn't just a wrongful arrest. This is a systemic pattern. If we can prove one instance of fabrication, it could expose many more." Alana felt a surge of hope. With the ACLU on her side, she might finally stand a chance against Brookside's machinery of corruption. Meanwhile, Kessler and Marlowe were desperate to identify the source of the leaked photograph. They cornered potential whistleblowers, made vague threats, even searched station surveillance footage to see who might have been snooping around. Isabel Reyes barely escaped suspicion. She kept her head down, covering her tracks carefully. Judge Langley, racked with guilt and paranoia, found himself sleeping less and drinking more. His wife noticed his erratic behavior, but he brushed off her concerns, blaming work stress. In private, however, he was on the verge of a breakdown. He had begun receiving additional anonymous threats, text messages hinting at the damning evidence that could surface at any moment. "It's too late," he thought in moments of crushing despair. "I've thrown in my lot with devils, and now I have to see this through." As the trial date neared, journalists from nearby cities took an interest. Talk show hosts invited civil rights activists to discuss the case, highlighting the long history of racially biased policing in communities like Brookside. For Alana, the trial was a battle for her very life. For Kessler, Marlowe, and Langley, it was a desperate attempt to maintain their grip on power, or lose everything. Neither side had any intention of backing down. And unbeknownst to the corrupt trio, fate had already begun turning the gears of their downfall. The morning of the trial dawned with an electric tension that crackled in the air. Crowds packed the sidewalks in front of the Brookside County Courthouse, their chants echoing through the city streets. Riot police stood by, anticipating large-scale protests. News vans lined the road, satellite dishes aimed skyward to broadcast every development to viewers across the state. Alana Carter arrived in a police transport van, her hands cuffed in front of her. Dressed in a conservative blue blazer and skirt provided by her grandmother, she held her head high despite the barrage of cameras flashing in her face. She was determined to face her accusers with dignity, even as her heart pounded in her chest. Inside the courtroom, she took her seat at the defense table beside Jason Meyer and Elaine Patterson, who had officially joined as co-counsel. Across the aisle, the prosecution team, handpicked by Kessler, organized their files. In the gallery, Kessler and Marlowe sat smugly in suits, playing the role of concerned investigators. Then, Judge Stephen Langley entered. His posture was rigid, his expression carefully controlled, but dark circles under his eyes betrayed his sleepless nights. The deputy district attorney opened the trial by painting a damning picture of Alana. He described how she had carefully built a double life, pretending to be a community activist while secretly running a drug operation. Their argument hinged on the mountain of fabricated evidence, the drugs found in her home, the burner phone, and the supposed anonymous tip that led to her arrest. Elaine Patterson delivered a scathing rebuttal. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady and authoritative, "we have seen how easy it is to fabricate evidence. How improbable is it that a woman with Alana Carter's background, who has spent her entire life advocating for justice, would suddenly become a drug kingpin? And why is it that the Brookside Police Department, which has a documented history of misconduct, is so determined to see her convicted?" She stopped just short of outright calling it a setup, but her tone left little doubt in anyone's mind. Judge Langley maintained an outward facade of impartiality, granting both sides the opportunity to present opening arguments. But he occasionally issued rulings that favored the prosecution, ensuring that certain questionable pieces of evidence were admitted. The defense team exchanged knowing glances. They could see they weren't just fighting the prosecution, they were fighting the very system itself. Outside, the protest continued to swell. Pastor Benjamin Wright led a group in prayer, chanting, "Justice for Alana." Others held signs demanding police accountability. The atmosphere was charged with urgency. Inside, Alana studied her accusers, Kessler and Marlowe, watching their every move. They exuded confidence, as if they truly believed they could bury her without consequence. But she could see the tension in their clenched jaws, the nervous way they tapped their feet. As the first day of proceedings wrapped up, speculation ran wild. The prosecution's case seemed airtight, but Patterson and Meyer knew the truth was far more complicated. They were counting on exposing enough inconsistencies to plant doubt in the jury's minds. Day 2 of the trial began with the prosecution calling their star witnesses, the officers involved in the raid. One by one, they testified about the supposed tip-off, the suspicious items found in Alana's apartment, and how she appeared nervous and agitated during her arrest. "Officer Grant, can you clarify the timestamp on the body camera footage?" she asked, her polite smile masking the sharp edge in her voice. The officer fumbled slightly before giving an approximate time. Patterson flipped through her notes. "Interesting," she said, "because your body cam shows you entering the building at 9:52 p.m. But the official arrest report states that the raid began at 10:15 p.m., which is accurate." The confusion on the witness stand was evident. It was a minor discrepancy, but it planted the seed that the officers' stories weren't as airtight as they claimed. Sergeant Marlowe was next. He tried to maintain a calm demeanor, but Patterson's line of questioning was merciless. "Tell me, Sergeant," she said, pacing slightly before turning to face him, "how is it that the evidence log shows you signed for the seized drugs at 10:02 p.m., yet the police transport logs indicate you left the scene at 10:05 p.m.? A hush fell over the courtroom. Marlowe stammered, searching for a plausible explanation, but none came. Though these inconsistencies might have seemed small on their own, each one undermined the prosecution's carefully crafted narrative. In the gallery, Kessler tapped his foot anxiously, glancing at Judge Langley as if to say, "Do something." But even Langley couldn't outright dismiss these discrepancies without drawing suspicion. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, the mood among the protesters shifted. News of the defense's incisive cross-examination spread quickly. People who had initially doubted Alana's innocence began reconsidering. And then came the moment that changed everything. On the third day of the trial, Elaine Patterson rose from her seat, her voice steady and confident. "Your Honor, the defense would like to call Officer Isabel Reyes to the stand." A ripple of shock swept through the courtroom. Kessler's eyes flared with fury. Marlowe looked as though he had been sucker-punched. Judge Langley's heart pounded in his chest. Isabel Reyes stepped forward, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. She took the oath and settled into the witness chair. Patterson began by establishing Isabel's credentials and her role within the precinct. Then, she shifted the conversation toward the discrepancies Isabel had uncovered. "What made you suspicious, Officer Reyes?" Isabel swallowed hard. "I noticed that the official timeline for the raid on Ms. Carter's apartment didn't match the dispatch records. When I tried to verify the evidence custody logs, I found multiple edits. Everything seemed too clean on paper, but the records themselves told a different story." Murmurs spread through the audience. Patterson then presented the documents Isabel had retrieved: mismatched timestamps, edited logs, erasures on the chain of custody forms. And then came the bombshell. The drugs found in Ms. Carter's apartment weren't drugs at all, Isabel testified. Lab tests confirmed the substance was baking soda. Gasps erupted. Judge Langley pounded his gavel, calling for order, but the damage was done. Kessler and Marlowe exchanged frantic glances. Their house of cards was collapsing. If the jury believed Isabel's testimony and the documents presented, Alana would almost certainly be acquitted. Worse, an investigation into police corruption would follow, potentially leading to criminal charges against them. Judge Langley's face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead. He had sold his soul to Kessler, and now he was watching everything unravel before his eyes. The next morning, forensic lab results officially confirmed the so-called drugs were a sham. By the time the jury deliberated, the prosecution's case had been shattered beyond repair. Less than 2 hours later, they returned with their verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Alana Carter, not guilty on all counts." A thunderous cheer erupted from the gallery. Reporters rushed to capture the moment. The protests outside transformed into celebrations. But the surprises weren't over. As soon as the verdict was read, internal affairs officers stepped forward. "Detective John Kessler, Sergeant Rick Marlowe," an officer announced, "you are under arrest for conspiracy, evidence tampering, and perjury." The hush that followed was deafening. Kessler shot to his feet, his face red with fury. "You can't do this. I'm a decorated officer." But the state troopers ignored him, snapping the cuffs around his wrists. Marlowe, ashen and shaken, offered no resistance. Judge Langley's gavel trembled in his hand. Before he could escape, an internal affairs officer turned to him. "Judge Langley, we have some questions for you." As he was led away, the last pillar of Brookside's corruption began to crumble. And Alana Carter, once framed and nearly destroyed, walked out of the courthouse a free woman, ready to take back everything they tried to steal. As Alana Carter stepped outside the courthouse, the roar of the crowd nearly overwhelmed her. Supporters cheered, chanted her name, and held up signs proclaiming justice for Alana and end police corruption. Flashbulbs from reporters' cameras lit up the evening sky as journalists thrust microphones toward her, eager for a statement. Jason Meyer and Elaine Patterson flanked her, shielding her from the overwhelming press. But before leaving the courthouse steps, Alana turned to face the crowd. Her voice was unsteady at first, but then it gained strength. "I am grateful that justice prevailed today," she said. "But this isn't just about me. It's about making sure no one else in Brookside, or anywhere, becomes the victim of corrupt officials who hide behind a badge or a robe. I plan to use my voice to make sure this never happens again." The crowd erupted into applause. Some people rushed forward, hugging her, patting her back, offering words of encouragement. In the middle of it all, Alana spotted her grandmother, Evelyn Carter. Tears streamed down the older woman's wrinkled cheeks as she pulled Alana into a fierce embrace. "I knew you'd come out on top, baby," Evelyn whispered. "I always believed in you." For the first time in what felt like forever, Alana allowed herself to break down, sobbing into her grandmother's arms. In the days that followed, Brookside witnessed a firestorm of repercussions. Kessler, Marlowe, and Judge Langley were all formally charged. Internal Affairs launched a sweeping investigation into the Brookside Police Department, uncovering years of abuse, false arrests, and extortion. Other officers, emboldened by Isabel Reyes' testimony, came forward with their own stories of corruption, detailing how evidence had been tampered with in multiple cases. The City Council held emergency meetings, pledging to establish an independent oversight commission to monitor police misconduct. For Alana, her name had been cleared, but her mission had only just begun. She became a local hero, a symbol of resilience and justice. Offers flooded in from law firms and advocacy groups, some even suggesting she run for public office. The ACLU extended an offer for her to join their regional office. But Alana had other plans. She didn't want to leave Brookside. She wanted to stay and fix the broken system from within. And then came the twist no one saw coming. Less than a month after the trial, the Brookside District Attorney announced a major restructuring effort aimed at rooting out corruption within the justice system. To everyone's astonishment, Alana Carter was appointed as a special investigator, overseeing the very police department that had tried to destroy her. The irony was undeniable. The same woman whom Kessler and Marlowe had framed now had the power to audit cases, investigate police wrongdoing, and recommend criminal charges against officers who abused their authority. Brookside had never seen justice served in such poetic fashion. The day Alana walked into the Brookside Police Department as a special investigator, a heavy silence filled the halls. Officers paused in their tracks, some exchanging wary glances, others offering small nods of respect. She carried herself with quiet confidence, her gaze steady as she approached her new office. The nameplate on the door read, "Special Investigator Alana Carter." She placed a trembling hand on it, memories flashing through her mind. Her arrest, the cold holding cell, the humiliation of being falsely accused. Now, she stood here, in a position of power. Not for revenge, but for justice. Her first order of business was reorganizing the department's oversight process. She scheduled a meeting with the department's leadership, setting a new tone of accountability and transparency. Then, she called Isabel Reyes into her office. When the young officer stepped in, she looked nervous, hat in hand. Alana met her gaze steadily. "Because of you, the truth came out." Isabel smiled sheepishly. "I just did what was right. This place, it can be better. But only if we root out all the bad apples." "We will," Alana promised. She thought about Kessler and Marlowe, now sitting in a jail cell, the very place they had tried to put her. Reports had surfaced that they had been denied bail, ironically enough, due to being flight risks. As for Judge Langley, his trial loomed on the horizon, the media already dubbing it the biggest corruption scandal Brookside had ever seen. The city braced itself for more revelations of bribery, misconduct, and deep-seated racism that had festered for decades. But Alana stood firm. She would shine a light wherever darkness thrived. In the aftermath, Brookside began its slow journey toward reform. Police officers underwent new training programs focused on racial equity and community engagement. Community leaders, once ignored, now had seats at advisory boards. The Brookside Tribune published a series of exposés on systemic injustice, calling it the city's necessary reckoning. Though the wounds ran deep, for the first time in a long time, Brookside dared to hope. And at the heart of it all stood Alana Carter. She had gone from prisoner to protector, from scapegoat to savior. Her voice, once almost silenced by corruption, now carried the weight of authority. The very officers who had tried to destroy her now sat in prison, powerless and exposed. The judge who had sold his honor for bribes now faced his own day of reckoning. It was a story of karma coming full circle. In a place where justice had once been sold to the highest bidder, an innocent woman had risen to dismantle the system that nearly crushed her. Alana Carter's story became legend in Brookside, a testament to truth, courage, and resilience. She had proven that even in the face of overwhelming corruption, justice could still prevail. And sometimes, it did so with a dramatic flourish that no one could have predicted. In the weeks that followed, Alana Carter wasted no time in setting her vision into motion. As the newly appointed special investigator, she combed through years of closed cases, searching for patterns of misconduct. What she found was even worse than she had imagined. Dozens of wrongful arrests, fabricated charges, and manipulated evidence that had sent innocent people to prison. Many of these cases bore Kessler and Marlowe's fingerprints. But they weren't the only ones. Other officers, emboldened by the lack of oversight, had engaged in similar corruption, forging a network of abuse that stretched deep into Brookside's legal system. Alana assembled a task force, bringing in honest officers like Isabel Reyes and partnering with outside legal experts to begin the painstaking work of reviewing each case. With every overturned conviction, with every freed prisoner, her mission became clearer: dismantle the system that had nearly destroyed her and rebuild it from the ground up. Her work, however, was met with fierce resistance. Despite Kessler and Marlowe's arrests, remnants of their influence still lingered within the department. Some officers viewed her as an enemy, resenting her authority and blaming her for the downfall of their colleagues. Others actively worked to undermine her, attempting to block investigations and spread rumors that she was only in her position for revenge. One evening, as Alana was leaving her office, she found her car vandalized, tires slashed, windshield cracked, and a crude message spray-painted across the hood: "Rat." She stared at it, her heart pounding, but refused to let fear take hold. This was exactly what they wanted, for her to feel intimidated, for her to back down. She wouldn't. Instead, she doubled down. The next morning, she walked into the precinct and called for a full internal review, demanding every officer undergo reevaluation. Those with records of misconduct were immediately placed under scrutiny. Some resigned before investigations could begin, knowing what was coming. Others were dismissed. Brookside's police force was shrinking, but for the first time in years, it was being rebuilt with integrity. Meanwhile, the trial of Judge Stephen Langley loomed on the horizon. The evidence against him was damning: bank records showing bribes from Kessler, secret correspondences detailing rulings in favor of corrupt officers, and his involvement in multiple wrongful convictions. The prosecution painted a clear picture. Langley hadn't just been an accomplice. He had been one of the architects of Brookside's corrupt system. The trial was swift. The jury found him guilty of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and accepting bribes. When the verdict was read, the former judge sat motionless, his once commanding presence reduced to nothing. A week later, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. With Langley's fall, the last major piece of Brookside's corrupt machine crumbled. For the first time in decades, there was real hope for change. But Alana knew her fight wasn't over. One afternoon, she met with Isabel Reyes at a small coffee shop near City Hall. The young officer had been instrumental in exposing the truth, but she still carried the weight of betraying her fellow officers. "I know it hasn't been easy for you," Alana said, stirring her tea. Isabel exhaled, shaking her head. I keep thinking about what could have happened if I'd stayed quiet. How many more people would have been framed? How many lives would have been ruined? You did the right thing, Alana assured her. And because of that, people are getting justice. Isabel nodded but still looked uncertain. But has anything really changed? There are still officers who think what we did was a betrayal. Alana leaned forward. Then we keep pushing. We don't stop until corruption isn't just exposed, it's eradicated. That evening, as Alana walked through the city, she saw firsthand the impact of her fight. The protests that had once called for her freedom had transformed into gatherings of community activism. People were demanding better policies, real reform, and accountability from those in power. A few months ago, Alana had been a prisoner, stripped of her dignity, accused of a crime she didn't commit. Now, she was a leader, holding the same system accountable that had tried to destroy her. But even as progress was being made, she knew one thing for certain. The fight for justice never truly ended, and she was just getting started. Months passed, and Brookside slowly began to change. The toxic remnants of Kessler and Marlowe's reign of terror were being scrubbed away, replaced by a justice system that, for the first time in years, was being held accountable. But change did not come easily. Alana Carter remained at the center of it all, pushing forward with relentless determination. As special investigator, she oversaw the review of dozens of wrongful convictions, each one revealing another layer of the corruption that had plagued the city for decades. More officers were exposed, more cases reopened, and more victims given the justice they had been denied for so long. But not everyone in Brookside celebrated the shift. Inside the police department, resentment simmered beneath the surface. Though Kessler and Marlowe were gone, their allies still lingered. Officers who had benefited from their corrupt system, men who had played their part in covering up misconduct, planting evidence, and keeping their silence when innocent lives were destroyed. To them, Alana wasn't a hero. She was a threat. One evening, after finishing a late-night meeting with city officials, Alana walked to her car in the dimly lit parking lot behind the courthouse. The moment she unlocked the door, she heard footsteps. She turned just in time to see a masked figure lunge at her. Instinct kicked in. She twisted out of the way, throwing up her arms as the attacker grabbed for her. A struggle ensued, grappling hands, the scrape of shoes on pavement, the sting of adrenaline surging through her veins. Then, suddenly, a flash of headlights. A car screeched to a halt, and a voice shouted, "Hey!" The attacker hesitated just long enough for Alana to break free. She stumbled backward, breath ragged, as the masked figure took off into the night. A moment later, Isabel Reyes sprinted toward her, gun drawn. "Are you okay?" Alana nodded, still catching her breath. "I'm fine." But that wasn't a random attack. They both knew what it meant. Someone wanted her silenced. The incident was reported, but no suspects were found. There were no security cameras in that section of the parking lot, no physical evidence left behind. The only thing Alana knew for certain was that the people who had spent years manipulating Brookside's justice system weren't done fighting back. But neither was she. Instead of retreating, Alana pressed forward harder than ever. She worked with Isabel to implement stricter accountability measures within the department, ensuring that every officer's history of complaints and disciplinary actions was publicly accessible. She collaborated with city leaders to establish an independent review board with the power to investigate police misconduct. She pushed for legislation that would prevent corrupt officers from simply resigning and moving to another department without consequence. And she made it clear to anyone still clinging to the old ways. Brookside was changing, and there was no turning back. Then came the final reckoning. 6 months after her appointment, the trial of Kessler and Marlowe began. Unlike Judge Langley, who had crumbled under the weight of his own guilt, the former detectives showed no remorse. They smirked through testimonies, whispered to their defense attorneys, and even exchanged occasional glances with their former allies in the police department. But the evidence against them was overwhelming. Patterson and Meyer had built an airtight case, with Isabel Reyes' testimony serving as the final nail in the coffin. When she took the stand, she didn't just expose Kessler and Marlowe's role in framing Alana. She provided proof of a dozen other cases where they had planted evidence, extorted suspects, and falsified reports. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. On a Friday afternoon, in a courtroom packed with journalists, activists, and former victims of their corruption, the verdict was announced. Guilty, on all counts. Alana sat motionless as the words rang out, her hands gripping the edge of the table. For so long, she had imagined this moment, wondered what it would feel like to see the men who had nearly destroyed her finally face justice. But as she looked at them, their expressions blank, their futures sealed, she felt no triumph. Only relief. It was over. The judge sentenced them both to 30 years in prison. Brookside had finally taken its first real step toward redemption. But Alana knew her work wasn't finished.